Well, we thank you for arriving and coming this afternoon for our seminar today. But before we begin, please be aware of the exit signs in the room in case we need to leave on short notice. The stairwell is in the back behind you, and if we need to leave the actual building, you'll be directed accordingly. For those that are on the internet watching today's seminar, we strongly encourage you for the Q&A, if you have questions, to send them to us. The address is on the monitor for you, to send it to us at first opportunity so we could have time to take it on the air. So with that, Maggie.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you all for joining us today on this research seminar. We're going to be talking about the study Developing New Methodology for Analyzing Potential Displacement. My name is Maggie Witt. I'm the contract manager for this research project. Before we hear from our researchers today, I wanted to provide a little bit of background and context to help you understand a little bit more about the Sustainable Communities Research Program here at ARB. For ARB's research program and other programs related to Senate Bill 375, sustainable communities are neighborhoods with safe, reliable, and affordable transportation choices that improve air quality, health, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They're neighborhoods with equitable and affordable energy and location-efficient housing options. And they're neighborhoods with improved access to quality employment, education, and other resources and services, and safe, vibrant surroundings. Specifically related to our research program, we support built environment research that helps us combat climate change, meet air quality standards, create healthier homes and communities, and work toward equality in environmental and health outcomes. We've categorized our research into 3 broad categories to try to help people navigate and find the information they're interested in. These categories are land use and transportation planning, green building and cool communities, and green buildings and cool communities. The information about all of our completed and ongoing research projects that fit into these 3 categories are found via the link that's on the top of this slide. And then the second website will take you to information about ARB's Sustainable Communities program. So all of our Sustainable Communities research is meant to support this program here at ARB. So you can go here to find information on sustainable community strategies reviews that happen here at ARB and ongoing efforts to update the SB 375 regional targets. So today's research seminar will focus on a land use and transportation planning related research project, developing new methodology for analyzing potential displacement. For this project, we assembled a diverse team of researchers from UCLA, UC Berkeley, and the Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG. And today you'll hear from the principal investigator for the project, Dr. Karen Chappell, and several other contributors, including Miriam Zook and Sam Maurer, who are here in person, and Drs. Dan Chapman and Paul Ong, who are joining us by phone. So a little bit on our study motivation. The reason why we sought out a study on this topic was so that we could better assess if and how investments in transit and transit-oriented development may be associated with gentrification and displacement in California communities. So while there hasn't been a hard causal connection established between transit-oriented development and displacement, from the outset, ARB was aware of the possible implications and therefore asked the researchers, among other things, to examine the range of actions and policies that could be used to minimize the impact, including the need for affordable housing. This research project is one part of ARB's broader effort to ensure that our policies and investments benefit all Californians, and especially those that live in disadvantaged communities. As you will hear in the following research presentation, there are many ways that this project has and will continue to support ARB's Sustainable Communities program. First, the research really underscores the need for higher density housing near transit, including more affordable housing units. that will both ensure equity and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals can be met. Second, it provides insights and tools that metropolitan planning organizations and local governments that they can use to factor in and reduce or avoid displacement, especially as they pursue efforts to increase transit availability and provide adequate housing along transit corridors. So in the presentation you're about to hear, the drive for equity is really at the heart of a lot of activities here at ARB, including this project. It's especially true in our policies and investments that support sustainable communities and transit-oriented development. To that end, the study is the start of an effort to try to gather more data and insights in what can be done to build a policy framework that supports sustainable communities that deliver improved quality life to all Californians. For more information, I encourage you to contact me. My contact information is on the screen. And then additionally, once again, there are links to more information about both our research program and our ARB Sustainable Communities program. So with that, I'll turn it over to our researchers who will present on the methods and the results of this project. And as Peter said after the presentation, we look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Maggie and the ARB for giving us the opportunity to present the findings from this study, which is so vital to the future of California's efforts to fight climate change. This study has been a long time in the works. We actually wrote the proposal 4 years ago. We released a draft of the study in 2015, 18 months ago. In the process of doing the study, we collected feedback from dozens of technical advisory committee members. After submitting the draft report, we collected dozens more comments that we then addressed. We have collectively, as a team, already given over 100 talks on these findings, and we published several articles and policy briefs. So this is all to say that what we say today may seem a little familiar. It has been very much a collective process. That's what I wanted to emphasize. And so we're very, very grateful to all of you out there, as well as our managers at the ARB, for all of your contributions to this study. Our research team consists of faculty, postdocs, and doctoral students at UC Berkeley and UCLA. I'd also like to give credit to many not listed here, the master students who served as our graduate student researchers and also took our several studios at UCLA and UC Berkeley on this research. What we're going to do today is that I will kick it off by walking through the first part of the report, the literature review and the analysis of neighborhood change. Then I'll turn it over to Sam Moret, who will discuss UrbanSim and PICAS models and their capabilities for analyzing displacement. Then Dan Chapman will discuss the potential VMT impacts of displacement. Miriam Zook will take over to discuss policy. I'll come back for the conclusions. And keep in mind that Dan Chapman and Paul Ong are available on the phone to answer your questions. The literature review covered a lot of material. It's already been published as a working paper at the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. So we discussed in the literature review trends in neighborhood segregation, in neighborhood change, how we might understand displacement, how we understand the role of public investment in gentrification and displacement, and the role of urban simulation models. In brief, here's what we found in the literature review. We found that neighborhood change is very slow, but over time we're seeing more income segregation and less racial segregation. Gentrification is characterized by two factors: new real estate investment and an influx of new residents with higher incomes and higher educational levels. There's very little research on public investment as a cause of gentrification. What we do know is that rail stations, schools, parks, and other investments are related to real estate premiums and also some forms of demographic change. There are many forms of displacement or forced moves. It's not just about new investment and raised rents that causes displacement. It's also about disinvestment. And we also have to acknowledge the role of exclusionary displacement, when low-income households can no longer move into a neighborhood. When we look at research on gentrification and displacement, we realize that good data is really hard to find. And so most are using proxies for gentrification and displacement to do their studies, or they look at just one form of displacement, like evictions. We find many methodological issues with previous studies. Many assume that gentrification leads to displacement, and they build their models based on that assumption. First gentrification comes, then we have displacement. We found, looking at the literature, and we confirmed this by our results, that the reverse could be true as well, that displacement can lead to gentrification. There are also many problems with how displacement and gentrification are defined in the literature and how studies use control groups. And you can read all about that in our literature review. We do find that many indicators and local data sets can help. We tried to look at many different of these indicators in our study using secondary data and case studies. So that's what I'll talk about next. Okay, so in terms of our research approach and methods, we start from the hypothesis that transit-oriented developments are associated with demographic and socioeconomic change. Now, I want to clarify something from the start. We use the term TOD in its broadest sense. We're not referring to specific developments, but transit neighborhoods, or the areas around fixed rail station areas. So this is a study about neighborhood change from transit investment, not the development of buildings per se. We constructed a database on neighborhood change and fixed rail transit from historic data. We focused in our analysis on Los Angeles County and the 9-county Bay Area, and we built a database that includes both census tract and address level sources. Our unit of analysis, our transit neighborhood, if you will, were census tracts, and these were census tracts with a fixed rail transit station within a half mile. And this is the type of data that we collected and joined in our data sets. So we started the study by defining TOD tracts, which we then compare to non-TOD tracts. In general, there's more churning in TOD tracts of these transit neighborhoods. So there are higher rates of households moving in and out than in non-TOD tracts. And this is particularly true, as you see from the figure on the left, for downtown Los Angeles. In terms of these in-movers, when we did a regression analysis, we found that they are less likely to be low income and less educated, and more likely to be higher income, non-Hispanic white, and have bachelor's degrees. In other words, it looks like what we understand as gentrification and exclusionary displacement are taking place around transit stations. We define gentrification based closely on the existing literature. We look at neighborhoods that at the base year were disadvantaged in some way in terms of socioeconomic status, and then they change in terms of education, race, and or income, as well as the real estate market. Our definitions differ slightly across Los Angeles and San Francisco, and this is intentional. These are two very, very different case studies, and so each warranted a quite different approach in analysis and a different focus. So looking at the extent of gentrification in Los Angeles and the Bay Area, we found overall that about 10% of census tracts had gentrified in the 13-year period under study for the study from 1990 to 2013. Sorry, 23-year study. So we then analyzed what were the factors behind this gentrification and what was the role specifically of transit neighborhoods in gentrification. And we found support for the transit neighborhood hypothesis. In Los Angeles, downtown TODs and recent TODs were more likely to gentrify. And likewise, in the Bay Area, TODs in the core cities, San Francisco and San Jose and Oakland, were more likely to gentrify than those elsewhere in the region. In general, older areas, more established neighborhoods were more susceptible to gentrification. So one of the things that we found here is that context really matters. It's not just TOD, but you really have to look at where that transit neighborhood is located within the entire region to understand whether it's likely to gentrify or not. We next looked at displacement through a number of different indicators. Now here, as I mentioned already, we're limited by the lack of data. The census doesn't have out-migration data, particularly for specific vulnerable groups. So we used proxy indicators. We looked at the loss of affordable housing, and there are many different ways of thinking about affordability. So we looked at each of them separately. We looked at the loss of affordable rentals. We looked at the loss of Section 8 housing. We looked at condominium conversions, and we looked at change in low-income housing tax credit housing. And then we also looked at direct displacement in terms of eviction, and we looked at the loss of low-income households in our San Francisco study area. So what did we find here? We found very mixed findings depending on what type of displacement we were looking at. In Los Angeles, we found that TODs were more likely to lose affordable rental units and experience more condo conversions. Outside of downtown in Los Angeles, there was more likelihood of losing the Section 8 vouchers. The transit neighborhoods in Los Angeles were less likely, interestingly, to have Ellis Act evictions. In the Bay Area, we found a different type of story. We found that outside of the core cities, TODs were actually experiencing more displacement of low-income households. And in San Francisco, there were more likely to be fault evictions near these stations. What was interesting to us, and this was maybe the biggest surprise here, is that we found a gain in affordability in TODs in certain areas, and that was where they were building new affordable subsidized housing, and that was a way to preserve affordability in the neighborhood. This should not actually be rocket science, but it was just really great to see that in our data that providing subsidized housing does make a difference. So a last part of our research process was a ground truthing process where we worked intensively with our technical advisory committee and community members and our researchers to really study conditions on the ground and to learn about the validity of our data and to see whether our results really held up according to real life perceptions of an area. And so we found that in general, people on the ground experience change a little bit differently from what we could show in the secondary data, perhaps because the data tended to be a little bit old. But there's also on the ground an anticipation of change that's very palpable that may not actually be bearing out in the neighborhood. Maybe the real estate market hasn't quite picked up as much as people think it has. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sam Murray, who will talk about urban sim.
Thank you, Karen. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about taking some of the prior findings about processes of gentrification and incorporating them into the decision-making tools that MPOs in California are using to evaluate land use and transportation policies. The background here is that metropolitan planning organizations use these large integrated forecasting models to project the greenhouse gas impact and the housing impact of different policy scenarios. And we wanted to see whether these models could also track displacement impacts as well. The basic questions are, first, how do the regional forecasting models currently represent displacement? And then second, how can these representations be enhanced? The research team looked at this for two specific models, the one used in the Bay Area and the one used in the Los Angeles region, and also developed some standalone tools that are more streamlined. So I'm going to cover each of those topics briefly. First, in the Bay Area, we use a platform called UrbanSim, which is a land use forecasting tool developed by Paul Waddell that's used by a variety of different MPOs. It uses iterative simulations to predict land use changes based on the economic and behavioral choices of households and firms and developers in response to policy contexts and market contexts. It's a pretty flexible modeling system, but it's tended to focus on land use outcomes rather than on household dynamics. So out of the box, it doesn't generate the kind of residential displacement metrics that we were interested in here. I'm going to give a little bit of background about how UrbanSim works, and then explain what we've done to improve its representations of displacement processes. So you can think of these models as having a data component and a math component. UrbanSim's data layer has a full representation of the region with things like households, buildings, zoning, and so on. And the data layer tracks the changes of those things from year to year as the model projects out into the future. And then the math layer is where the calculation steps are specified for predicting each of the changes. And the calculation steps come from things like statistical models and policy assumptions. Some of the key forecasting steps are things like updating the home price projections, predicting household moves, matching households to new housing, predicting which parcels will be developed or improved, and things like that. The overall intention with UrbanSim is for the individual components of the model to be behaviorally realistic and easy to interpret while also being calibrated to large-scale dynamics. Operationally, a land use forecasting model like UrbanSim is paired with a travel demand model so that land use changes will feed into the travel behavior changes and infrastructure improvements will feed back into the land use forecasts. This slide is just an example of the inputs that go into one of the more complicated components of UrbanSim, which is the real estate development projections. So in UrbanSim, at the most basic level, residential displacement is going to show up as a combination of households moving out of their current housing and then moving into housing in a different location. So those are the components of the model that we were most focused on improving. Here we see that the most important determinants of a household's likelihood to move are things like lifestyle characteristics and housing tenure, plus other factors like income, cost burden, sources of potential discrimination, and so on. The factors in blue on the right, tenure, rent burden, and race ethnicity, were things that weren't tracked at all in the Bay Area's model prior to this work. And housing tenure in particular was crucial for us to integrate into the model. So our approach for improving the Bay Area model was first to make some low-level architecture changes in the data layer, building the model up from individual housing units rather than from parcels, because that makes it easier to track tenure and some of the other variables that we needed to include. And then on the math side, we re-specified the relevant calculation steps, paying particular attention to the determinants of household moves in the projections. The biggest change is that the model now tracks market rents in parallel to sale prices so that we can capture things like rent cost burden and tenure of households. Our main product from this piece is that we have a working fork of MTC's operational land use model that's now able to generate rough displacement forecasts alongside the other model output. We haven't done the type of scenario development or model calibration that would go into a regional plan, but the general dynamics that we're seeing in the Bay Area estimation data are exactly what we'd want to see based on the other research results here. It's things like renters being a lot more likely to move than owners, higher rent cost burdens being associated with a greater likelihood of moving, and households tending to be clustered near others of the same race or ethnicity. And seeing these small-scale dynamics in the simulation model makes us feel like at a first pass, the long-term forecasts are going to be capturing some of the dynamics that we're interested in here. As an ongoing effort, we're working with MTC right now to incorporate the research improvements into the actual operational model that's used for the regional plans. They're quite interested in all of these improvements, but we weren't able to make the cut for the current planning cycle. The changes will show up in the next planning cycle. Another important piece of the modeling to mention is provision of below market housing, which we've made some progress on representing in the urban sim model, but it requires a lot of tailoring to local policy environments to cover all of the different categories that Karen was just mentioning. So now I'm going to switch gears and say a little bit about the Los Angeles regional model. This work was done by colleagues at the Southern California Association of Governments. The Los Angeles region uses a land use modeling platform called PCAS, which works differently from Urban Sim. It's a zone-based model, and the data layer focuses on economic production, population aggregates, and then the associated land use and real estate development that's implied by the economic changes and population changes. In this model, the forecasts come from equilibrium allocations of economic activity and housing development rather than from sequences of individual model steps like Urban Sim. So the Los Angeles model, because of its different structure, it ended up being too aggregate to directly capture the dynamics of residential displacement because it focuses on net changes rather than differentiating among the individual households within a zone. So what the team focused on was adding a number of associated variables to the model output and on improving the calibration of the model in particular neighborhoods of interest in Los Angeles, which you can read about in the report. And then finally, I wanted to mention the off-model tool development that some other members of the research team have put together. This is a spreadsheet tool where you can directly explore predictions of gentrification factors for individual census tracts, and it's calibrated using statistical regression directly on the census tracts rather than incorporating all of the complexities of the regional land use modeling tools. Okay, who do we turn it over to next?
Hi, Dan. Are you ready to begin your portion?
Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Dan Chapman at UC Berkeley, and I'm sorry I couldn't join in person. Just so
Hey,
you know,
Dan, can you pause for just a sec? We're going to try to turn up your volume.
Sure.
And I'll flip your slides for you if you can just let me know when to go to the next.
I will, and I am looking at the webcast, but I'm noticing about a 3 or 4 second lag, so it's going to be a little challenging.
Oh, okay. That's
but
funny.
I'll tell you, I'll certainly, I have my own slides with notes here, so I can tell you which one to go to, and hopefully that'll do the trick.
Okay. I think we've got your volume better, so you can go ahead and get going.
Okay, thanks so much, and let me reiterate the thanks that Karen listed and discussed earlier at the beginning. Thanks to everyone for their inputs and for the support for the project. So I took the lead on a portion of this work which really is a bit different than some of the other parts. The data that we used are a bit different, and the question was a bit different. So this part of the work was looking at the question of if household displacement and household gentrification occurred near rail station areas, what would happen to auto use, or a term that we use often in this line of work is vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. And so answering this question required using different sorts of data, not census tract level data, but actually household level data from a couple of different travel surveys. And it was basically a little bit like a thought experiment based on a lot of data, a lot of household level data. And that the experiment was to try to understand what happened to total regional VMT, vehicle miles traveled, when a neighborhood near transit gentrifies. Now, it's just about impossible to find the data that are needed to answer this question directly. One would need to know how incoming, higher income households traveled prior to moving into a TOD area, or how they would have traveled if they weren't able to live there. And one would also need to know how a displaced lower income household would be likely to travel once forced to go elsewhere. And now, we don't have data on auto use over time from the same households. And without conducting one's own large-scale survey of at least 1,000 households, it's really hard to get there. But there is a way to do this looking at two other things, and that's what we did in this part of the work. We looked at the auto use of households at different income levels who lived in different places, and we compared them to infer what the net auto use, or VMT impact, would be of a higher. And by the way, I'm still on the first slide. Sorry, Maggie, I'm actually still on the first slide. We can infer what the net VMT impact would be of a higher income person coming into a TOD and a lower income person leaving a TOD. And then the other part of the work that we did was to look at actual data on neighborhood change and to use the same cross-sectional VMT information to infer how gentrification would affect VMT in comparison to what would have been the case if the neighborhood had been preserved. So that's an overview of what I did. And now I'd like to look at the research questions slide, so that's where we should be now. The overall research question was how we can expect gentrification and displacement caused by transit-oriented development to affect regional VMT. And that entailed three sub-questions. And Maggie, if you want to just put those three up, those are: how does VMT vary among those at different income levels living inside and outside of TODs? And that just means near and far away from rail stations. The second one is: how much do people of different income levels appear to drive in response to transit accessibility when controlling for other factors? And then, given the answers to these two questions, how much would displacement of lower income by higher income households likely affect regional VMT? And what about typical gentrifying tracts? What about those census tracts that Karen discussed earlier? What would happen if we looked at the change that happened over that 23-year period to VMT? So I want to emphasize one thing before we go to the next slide, which is the most important question from a GHG, from a greenhouse gas perspective, is what happens to auto use regionally, under the assumption that gentrification and displacement does occur in TODs. And so this part of the work really doesn't address all of the other issues that are really problematic with gentrification and displacement, having to do with people's situations becoming worse after being forced to leave due to rent increases or other dynamics that lead to displacement. We're only really looking at the question of, okay, what's the net effect on travel across the region? That's the intention of this part of the work. Okay, so the next slide is Datasets. And if Maggie, if you could switch to that one for me. And Maggie, if you can just go ahead and put up all the bullets at once for this one. There are two data sets that we relied upon that are a little different from each other. The first one is the National Household Travel Survey, which was conducted in 2009, and it was conducted across the United States, but it also had a pretty big sample within California. these data included the household location, but only to the specificity of the census block group. It included about 16 to 17,000 households in metropolitan areas in the state. And the estimate of total auto use, annual vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, was done using vehicle odometer readings. So that's one data source with a pretty big sample, but a relatively small fraction of those total households living near transit in the state. And then the second data set was the California Household Travel Survey, which was conducted between 2010 and 2012. And this had more specificity, better specificity, basically latitude, longitude, street address level specificity for most of the observations, and a larger sample size. And then the VMT was calculated by the travel diary, with a travel diary method in which people were asked where they went for every single trip, every single activity during the day was captured, and then there was a separate estimate done of the network distance for each of those trips to come up with an aggregate estimate of total auto use. So the second data set's a bit better than the first, but we wanted to look at both because there's not that much evidence out there on this question. In fact, there's very little at all, and so we wanted to look at more than one data source. As I will show in subsequent slides, the analysis here focuses on all metropolitan areas in the state, but we also zoom in specifically on the Los Angeles metropolitan area and the San Francisco Bay Area separately. All right, Maggie, if you would go to the next slide, which is a graphic. So on our next slide, what you see here is average household VMT by income category and rail access for the NHTS data, for the first of the two data sets. And this is for all California metropolitan areas. And what I want you to notice here is the red line. Let me explain what this is first. The red line is all households who live not near a rail station, outside of a half-mile radius of a rail station. And this is a bit more, as I said before, spatially specific than the map you saw earlier because it is, for NHTS, it's block group level rather than census tract. So there's a smaller percentage of total area that's really near a rail station. And you can see that the blue line is those people who live near rail, the red line is those who live farther away from rail. What this shows is that at each income level, from left to right, less than $50,000 per year, between $50,000 and $75,000 per year, between $75,000 and $100,000 per year, and more than $100,000 per year, there is a reduction in total VMT associated with being near a rail station. And that reduction varies depending on income. So at the lowest level of income shown in this slide, which is less than $50,000 per year per household, the reduction in VMT associated with being near a rail station is somewhere around 8 miles per day. When you go up to the highest level of income, greater than $100,000 per year, $100,000 per year per household, the total VMT reduction that is associated with living near a rail station is about 20 miles per day. So at first blush, what we're learning here is that if you believe that if people move from a place that is not near rail to a place that is near rail, that this is the difference, it implies that the reduction of vehicle miles traveled is higher for higher income groups than for lower income groups. And we're going to come back to this because this big difference tends to go away once you control for other factors. A couple brief notes before we move to the next slide. The first one is that we're using household income in categorical form like this, even in our more detailed analysis, because that is how it's reported in the NHTS and the CHTS. Their categories of the two travel surveys are slightly different from each other, so we've aggregated them for these graphs to be able to compare. All right, so Maggie, could you go to the next one, which is average household VMT by income category and rail access for the CHTS data. And what you can see here is a very similar pattern. The scale is different, and so it makes it look like it's a bigger difference between lower and higher income people, and that's just an unfortunate artifact because the scale should have been kept the same across the two graphs. The amount of daily average VMT in the California household travel survey data is lower than it is in the data from the NHTS, and there are technical reasons for why this might be that I won't get into here. You can read about it in the chapter. We would expect some differences, and basically what you're seeing is the same sort of pattern as in the previous graph, and this in the previous graph suggests that rich households who move into TOD areas will have a higher reduction of VMT than poorer households to do so. But again, that depends on the other characteristics of those households, and it suggests the need for a controlled analysis. So that's what I'll turn to next, is a slide which says controlled analysis specifications at the top. And let's see here. I think on this one, if you go to it, Maggie, it's just going to show the whole thing. Great. So what we did here is to do an analysis, a regression analysis that tries to account for the fact that while the cross-sectional data show that VMT differences associated with rail access are larger for higher income households, there are lots of other factors than rail access that may play a role, such as household size, the age of the primary, or the age of the respondent to the survey, which is one randomly selected adult, whether the household only has one adult, the sex of the respondent, the race ethnicity of the respondent, and there's a number of other observed factors that could also influence auto use, which could also be correlated with both rail access and income. For example, higher income households who live near rail may also have a smaller household size, and they may be less likely to have children in the household, and than the lower income households who live near rail. And if that's the case, then you would expect lower VMT associated with those households. So what we do is we do this controlled analysis in which we stick a bunch of independent variables into the equation, and we try to see what the separate controlled effect of income and rail proximity together have on VMT. And why are we doing this? Again, the whole point of this is to see what the net effect of displacement and gentrification might be under different scenarios. To get there, we need to go through this analysis to figure out, okay, well, what are the VMT differences that are associated with rail access? When a higher income household moves near a rail station and displaces a lower income household, what's the net effect on regional VMT? So there's lots of details about this, and I don't want to take up too much time. I'm happy to answer questions later. We can't control for everything. I've named most of the important control variables. We weren't able to include additional important variables in this analysis, such as parking availability or the characteristics of the household workers, of the workplaces of the household workers. For example, do they have rail access at their workplace? Is it possible for them to take transit to the workplace, or is it possible for them to walk because it's they have closer workplace locations than people who live farther away from transit? So we can't do everything in the analysis, but we can do a fair amount. All right, Maggie, if you could go to the next one, which is controlled findings from regression models and overview. And Maggie, if you wouldn't mind going bullet by bullet for this one. So to start with just the title, we estimated models with, Maggie, would you mind just showing the title, and let's go bullet by bullet because it'll be a little bit easier for people to follow. So starting just with the title, we estimated models with CHTS. Actually, have that first bullet up there. I'm sorry, Maggie. We'll have the first bullet up there, and I'm going to basically read the first bullet. We estimated models with NHTS and CHTS data, as I said before. We estimated the models for all metropolitan areas. We estimated individually for Los Angeles. We estimated individually for the San Francisco Bay Area. And we also represented household income in two different ways, and one of those was with a continuous and a squared term, and the other one was with threshold variables. And this is a technical, set of technical details, but it's important because it tests whether or not the way the model is structured yields different results. And we did find some differences. But in short, if you go to the next bullet, what we found So we ran 12 regressions with these data in different places, different sorts of data, and with representing income in different ways. And we found basically half the time, in terms of the models, there was no significant differential effect of rail proximity on VMT by income. And let me just unpack that a little bit. What that means is that in most of the analysis, we didn't find any real difference in how households of different incomes respond to rail access. So what that would imply is that if a single high-income household comes into a TUD area and displaces a single low-income household, that we don't find any evidence that that's going to affect VMT regionally. Now, to be clear, it would probably affect VMT locally. That is to say, higher income households do drive more than lower income households, and therefore there would be more traffic near the rail stop. That seems clear. But what's also clear is that we don't find any evidence that the net regional auto use would change. And that's in 6 of the 12 regressions. If you go to the next slide, not the next slide, I'm sorry, the next bullet number 3, when the regressions that use the more reliable CHTS data, that's the California Household Travel Survey data, the ones that are more spatially specific and the one that has a larger sample size, these are unequivocal in finding that the VMT difference that is associated with rail access is no greater with lower income than with higher income households. So we do have some differences among people with different income levels, but the CHTS data, either the VMT difference is greater for higher income households. In other words, the reduction associated with rail access is higher for higher income households, or it's no different than the VMT difference for lower income households. And then going to the final bullet here, in 2 of the regressions using the less reliable data set in HTS, we did find that middle income households had a smaller VMT reduction with rail proximity than did lower income households. Now I want to stay here for a second before I go to the next slide and just talk about what the meaning of this is. The main meaning is that the preponderance of the evidence suggests that a pattern of 1-to-1 displacement is unlikely to increase VMT. In two of the regression results in Los Angeles and in metropolitan areas across the country, there is evidence that if middle-income households displaced lower-income households, there could be a VMT increase. All right, so what I want to do is just in the course of the next couple of slides, just show you the representation of this a little bit. And I'm going to kind of go over these quickly because I know I'm taking a lot of time. So the next slide says graphed results from linear and squared income models. And there's a little asterisk after it because what I'm not showing here is that 4 out of the 6 models that used income, that represented income in this way, did not find any statistically significant interaction between income and rail access, which meant that there was no difference in how much rail access affected VMT across income. Rail access had the same effect in those other controlled models, regardless of income. But in these 2 models, there was a significant interaction, and the way to interpret this graph is there are 2 instances in which there was a significant interaction, in which there's different responsiveness by different income groups. And here we have a more fine-level breakdown of income, and all those little X's or diamonds refer to a midpoint of an income category. I'm not going to go over what the income categories are. Suffice to say, one of them is less than 25,000, and one of them is greater than 100,000, excuse me. And what you see here is that the VMT reduction associated with income is around, for the orange line there, which represents all metropolitan areas in California, it's around 10 miles per day, less VMT if you live near rail. If you're in the lowest income category, it's barely 2 or 3 miles per day if you're in that middle income category there, and then it goes up to more than 15 miles per day reduction for the highest level of income. And there's a similar pattern for Los Angeles, which is the blue line, except that for Los Angeles, transit proximity is actually associated with a higher VMT. Now, as I said before, these models are a little funky because the data are a little bit less reliable in the following sense. Those middle income categories are very small in the LA data specifically, and in general, that's true across the board for the NHTS. The middle income categories don't have as much representation. So that's graphed results from that model. Very briefly, the next, if you can go to the next slide, Maggie. What the next slide shows is a kind of a messy result that I'm showing for to be completely transparent about what our results were. And what this shows is a similar kind of pattern in that if you look at all these graphs, you look at the orange ones only. The orange graphs are for the California Household Travel Survey and for the Nationwide Household Travel Survey for all metros in California. And they show a little bit of an uptick in the middle income category with VMT and a downtick with higher income. For Los Angeles, the blue lines, what they show is a not much difference in VMT up until you get to the $60,000 level, and then it goes, and then the differential goes way down for higher levels of income. So just looking at the blue solid line, what this solid line shows is that in the California Household Travel Survey for Los Angeles only, there's a greater VMT reduction associated for rail at higher levels of income. It goes from only 5 miles less down to almost 25 miles less. But for the NHTS data, it's all over the place. It's lower for a lower income. It gets higher up until middle income, then it goes way down again for greater than $75,000 in income, and then goes up again for the highest levels of income. All right, so I'm going to go to the final slide. I'm sorry, it's not the final slide. We have 3 more slides to go. What does all of this mean? Well, first of all, there's a question of what happens with displacement if we kind of think about it on a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 basis. So first bullet, Maggie, the varying only rail proximity, what do these results imply, assuming that poor households are displaced by richer households? And the answer here is, well, even using all of these results, including the ones that are a little bit less reliable and a little bit strange, what if high-income households displace low-income households in the 1-to-1 basis? And we look only at the metropolitan area results, and we don't look at the smaller sample CHTS and NHTS results for San Francisco or for Los Angeles. What we find is that on a 1-to-1 basis, there is either no change in VMT or possibly a 22% reduction in VMT, depending on whether you use the controlled estimates or the uncontrolled estimates. The reason that we might use the uncontrolled estimates is we might think that part of what's happening is a self-selection process, that households who want to live near transit in order to reduce their VMT are in fact doing that. And so that process may in fact go on, and that would be more readily compared to the uncontrolled models than to the controlled models. What is each high-income household arriving in the TOD displaced 2 low-income households? And here, you can see there is one model that suggests there could be a reduction of 7% still, and another model that suggests that this would increase VMT by 23%. And so there's some variance here, but in general, what we've done here is to look at the question in this abstract way, and in the abstract sense, we find, yes, you could imagine displacement scenarios if there's enough displacement happening that for example, if you have a high-income household that's coming in and as part of a redevelopment process, let's say that there was some housing that was being destroyed or that was turning over and being used for something else, and meanwhile larger units were being developed near transit, that you could have a scenario that looked more like bullet number 2. And in that case, yes, we would expect an increase in regional VMT. So the next slide,
Hey, Dan, this is Maggie. I was just going to say that we have one more section, and I don't want to be a time czar, but if we could just wrap up this section real quick, that'd be great.
Okay, great. So what the next slide shows, let's skip the next slide, which is hypothetical gentrification illustrations using census tract data. Let me just say that you can show the graph. What this shows is that if you look at actual census tracts that have gentrified, what has happened there has been that gentrification has typically been accompanied by an increase in population. So in net, what we found in this part of the study is that displacement in TODs is likely, and we'll go to the last slide, my last slide, Maggie. Displacement in TODs is likely to increase VMT and thus greenhouse gases only if the population that lives there declines. The second bullet, our data analysis suggests that higher income households reduce VMT as much as or more than lower income households when they locate in TODs, that is to say near rail. And then finally, what we found by looking at some of the other analysis that was done elsewhere in this project was that census tracts that are near rail stations that underwent gentrification in California between 1990 and 2013 also typically increased in population. And that sort of a pattern means that we would expect a reduction in regional VMT, and whether it's higher or lower income households isn't as germane as simply the sheer number of households. The only caveat to that is those rail proximate areas need to be the sort that actually do decrease VMT. They need to be the kinds that have low parking availability, higher local retail density, good bus service, and are relatively near to the CBD. These sorts of changes in those sorts of places are likely to reduce regional VMT, and the population effect, the densification effect, swamps the differences in households themselves by income. And sorry I took so much time, but I'm done.
Dan. And Miriam, you're going to cover the next section?
Is this on? Yes, it sounds like it's on. Okay. Thanks so much, Maggie. So what do we do about all this? Clearly, and we don't have time to get into why we care about displacement beyond VMT, but there are plenty of reasons why we should care about household displacement and low-income displacement, and much of that you can find on our research website. But so what do we do about displacement, and how do we prevent it or mitigate it, so which are the motivating questions of this policy analysis section. First, we started off trying to look at the academic literature. What does the academic literature say about anti-displacement policies and their effectiveness? Well, the academic literature really doesn't say anything. There is almost no research on evaluating the effectiveness of policies on anti-displacement. So we look to see really what is out there then. If academic literature can't really share much, what can we learn about what this field looks like, and what's on the ground currently, and what are people talking about? So we started off doing an inventory of both planning documents, advocacy documents. When people talk about anti-displacement, what are the policies and strategies that they look at? And so we generally classified them into four main categories. One is clearly subsidized affordable housing production, so creating stable affordability in neighborhoods. The next is preservation strategies, so looking at how do you preserve affordability in certain neighborhoods. And then clearly tenant protections, how do you assure that tenants can stay in their homes and don't have dramatic rent increases that leads to displacement. And finally, looking more on the asset building side, so how do we ensure that residents can afford to live in these gentrifying neighborhoods. And so there's tons of different ways to look at these policies, from sort of short-term actions to long-term actions, from preventative side to more responsive side, so perhaps providing relocation benefits. But essentially, we looked at all of these. We did some stakeholder interviews and speaking with experts on housing policy experts to talk about like what are people really looking at right now, in terms of displacement. And we came up with this list of strategies that we actually inventoried for both the Bay Area, 9-county Bay Area jurisdictions, and LA County jurisdictions. And we looked through all of the municipal codes, the housing elements, their plans to see what policies are on the books in these places. So again, just taking a step back, we looked at preservation strategies, affordable housing production strategies, and asset building strategies, these 13 to 14 strategies in each. And there's some strategies on the books, and again, this is what's on the books, not necessarily what's being implemented or enforced. But really, what we see is a dearth of policies and strategies. And so there's certain cases that actually most cities have, sort of like condominium regulations. So controlling the amount that people can convert apartments into condos, and then certain where you see maybe one jurisdiction having certain things. We also see that the Bay Area jurisdictions have a lot more policies on the books than LA County jurisdictions. So we then took it, that was just sort of like establishing the landscape, and in the report you can see maps of where these are and a little deeper dive into some of the more prevalent policies. But then we looked really very specifically at transit investments and transit plans, station area plans, and what those are saying about displacement. So in the Bay Area, we looked at MTC's station area planning program, which is sort of the predecessor for their current priority development area plans. In 2005, they developed a TOD policy that was really specific to 9 transit expansion areas. And in this first policy in 2005, they required these plans to talk about housing. This is back in the day when transportation and land use and housing were 2 separate fields, so this was like innovative at the time to talk about them side by side. So they said you need to talk about housing, you need to plan for housing, and it would be, you have an extra incentive to talk about affordable housing and quantify affordable housing goals. And in an evaluation of the effectiveness of that plan, a consulting firm said, this was great, but actually most jurisdictions said that those incentives really didn't make a difference. That they didn't really affect how they were planning for affordable housing. This program was expanded again into the station area plans and then the priority development program. And there were guidelines in their station area planning program to include an affordable housing and anti-displacement strategy. And so it had specific language about here are a number of different types of policies that you should think about in these plans, but no directive this is exactly what you should be doing. And when we looked at all of those 34 completed station area plans that are up on MTC's website, we saw that less than half of them had quantified affordable housing goals or any real policy language to talk about anti-displacement. Then you moved into the current sort of regime in the Bay Area, which is called the One Bay Area Grant. We looked at round 1. They're currently on round 2 of this grant program, and this created a competitive grant, really again to sort of incentivize action in the Bay Area. To apply for this money, you had to have an adopted housing element, and there was a certain formula base that looked at your housing production in compliance with RENA. But each congestion management association, which are the ones who are sort of allocating out this money, they came up with their own selection criteria for the programs that they were going to be funding. And so some decided to reward affordable housing production and different strategies, but some didn't. And here we looked at the amount of money that went to different jurisdictions in the One Bay Area grant. That's on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis is the number of anti-displacement policies, the ones that we quantified in that previous graph. And as you can see here, there's really absolutely no relationship between them. So something that we're learning from this process is that incentives, while great, they look good, don't really have much of an effect on local policy. In Los Angeles, we looked at the new Metro Joint Development Policy that mandates that 35% of housing units in Metro Joint Development are be affordable. And we also looked at 8 station neighborhood plans, specific area plans, and Todd community plans. What we found from those 8, that only 3 of them had any language about displacement and varying degrees about affordable housing. So it's starting to be talked about, but it's really, there is no real consistency yet, at least in regards to transportation planning and transportation area planning. Thank you. So then we also did policy case studies. So in each region, we looked at 3 different neighborhoods where, according to our analysis that Karen presented earlier, we would have expected to see gentrification, but we didn't see it. So from 90 to 2000, in analyzing the data from that time period, we would have thought that it would have gentrified from 2000 to 2013, and it didn't. So we looked in those 3 neighborhoods in each region to see what's going on in there. So in Bay Area, we looked at San Francisco Chinatown, the city of East Palo Alto, and San Jose, the Diridon Station area. And in Los Angeles, we looked at Chinatown, the Hollywood Western Station area, and the Watts Towers Metro Station area. And when looking at these across all of these case studies, what we found is that there's clear need and emphasis on local community organizing, that any kind of strategies that they have for preservation or affordable housing production is a direct result of community organizing in those areas. And we know from, again, these case studies is that it's not one policy, there's no silver bullet here, that there's no one policy that's going to answer the needs of these communities, that it's really a mix of policies. We heard over and over again the importance of rent stabilization hand in hand with just cause for evictions ordinances, and also with a real government commitment for affordable housing, which we don't see in most jurisdictions in these areas. And then again, housing production is key. We need to be producing housing both for all income levels, but especially for low-income households. And then finally, in some of these areas, we didn't see gentrification not because of any explicit strategy. We saw it because of some of the unintended consequences of the housing crisis. We saw it because of overcrowding. So we weren't seeing gentrification because when people are being pushed out of their homes, they might not be leaving because they're moving in with their relatives or their neighbors. And we also saw a certain neighborhood disadvantage that was preventing gentrification from happening, like poor low quality schools, lack of amenities, and perceived unsafety in these neighborhoods. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Karen to just give us a wrap up.
Thank you all. So just to wrap up here, so we come to some conclusions from this research, and we have directions for future research as well. So first of all, transit neighborhoods, what we call TOD, leads to gentrification. It depends on the context. The specific context influences the outcome. TOD may also lead to displacement. This takes different forms in different areas, and it may be in the form of loss of affordable housing. It may be in the shifts of low-income households. We find that VMT is lower near transit. We find that the regional impacts of displacement may be 0 or positive. More research is needed. We do find in this segment that adding more population, adding more density is one way to get the biggest bang for your buck in your transit station area. In our analysis of the models, we found that Urban Sim is able to be modified. The SCAG-PICUS model is not able to be modified at this point to analyze displacement. And finally, in terms of understanding policy, again, we're at a very premature stage in terms of diagnosing specific policies to fit different places, and we need much more research to understand what to do in different contexts. All in all, we see that this research gives us a significant body of evidence that we should look at SB 375 again and think about how regions might best analyze displacement pressures that come in the Sustainable Community Strategies process. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So we have a few minutes for question and answer. So if you're here in the room, you can just raise your hand and I'll come to you with the mic. And then folks can send questions over email as well. All right, I'll take one from in the room and then I'll read one from the internet.
Who had a question? Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is Bill Dean at Kelly, PA. Do you know anything about the people that displace, where they go, how far away do they go? Are they able to keep the current jobs they have? Do they have bigger commutes, lower commutes? Or do you know any of that stuff?
Yeah, go ahead.
So from the data that we analyzed for this study, no, we don't know that. We've been doing a study in San Mateo County where we've been doing a survey of people who've been evicted from their homes. What we're finding there is about 3/4 of people in San Mateo County, so one of the highest cost regions in the country. 3/4 stay within 5 miles, and then a quarter move more than 25 miles away, mostly moving to the Central Valley. We find that we're seeing large impacts on commutes, on all sorts of things, on people's jobs, on the education of their kids. But I would also say that I think it was a third of the people that we surveyed in the 2 years post-eviction were either homeless or marginally housed, so living on sofas or wherever they could find. So if people are able to stay, they're moving to lower quality neighborhoods, they're moving in with friends, et cetera. And if they're not able to stay in the Bay Area, at least, they aren't able to stay in the Bay Area, right? It's not like they're moving to the East Bay, they're moving outside of the Bay Area completely.
Okay, I'm going to read one from our webcast participants. This one is from John Holtzclaw, and it sounds like more of a comment, but then you can see if you might to respond. VMT from odometer readings would be more accurate than household travel survey. Larry Frank in Atlanta found some 20% of trips missed in household travel survey 15 to 20 years ago. He gave them free smartphones which tracked location for follow-up queries. California BAR, Bureau of Automotive Repair, can provide odometer readings for vehicles from owner name and address or vehicle ID number, which is free to you.
I think this is a question for Dan, if Dan wants to respond.
Hi, John. Thanks for your question. One quick comment on that. I have not found it. My understanding is it's much harder to get the DMV data from the state than what your issue with that associated with it. So you don't know anything about the characteristics of the household. And then regarding the NHTS data versus the CHTS data, I guess your question implies that the NHTS data are more reliable. Unfortunately, the NHTS data are not actual odometer data. They are estimated odometer data. So I could get into it in more detail, but in my view, the CHTS data are more reliable.
Hi, I'm Ina Lupin. I'm a graduate student at UC Davis in community development. And this question is also actually for Dan. Sorry, but I was wondering if you're familiar with Will Dominy's study from 2012 that also looks at the effects of gentrification on TOD and had sort of the opposite results in a specific neighborhood, I believe in LA. So I was wondering if you just have any comment on the differences in results from the two studies and if you have thoughts about the methodology of that study in comparison to your own. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Yeah, we did take a look at that study, and I'm not remembering the specific details, but what I remember about it is that it looked at local VMT and not regional VMT. And so the issue with displacement is understanding before and after travel, and that's tough to do. In other words, yes, you do expect that VMT is going to go up near stations. And a number of studies, including I believe it was Dominy was one of those, showed this to be the case. But the larger question from a greenhouse gas perspective is, overall regional, state, global DMT and what happens when displacement and gentrification occur. And that's the question that we tried to answer in this study. And beyond that, I do appreciate your referring to it. It's a very good paper, especially for a master's thesis.
Great. I'm going to take another question from, yeah, this is it. One more question from the webcast participants. This one is from Ian Monroe. He asks, or he comments, intuitively, building new housing should prevent displacement, yet much of the research starts with the premise that TOD causes displacement. What is the research actually saying about transit-oriented housing construction and displacement?
Well, as I mentioned at the outset, our scope was really to look at transit neighborhoods and these areas around transit stations and look at the relationship between that transit investment and neighborhood change in the area. So along the way, we had data on market rate and subsidized housing, and we were able to do a little analysis on that, but we don't have definitive results on that front, and that's really the next study that we do.
Any more questions from in the room here?
Muriel Stan, former ARB staffer. So in San Francisco, were you also looking at Muni, or was it just too built up to make a difference?
Muni is included as if the fixed rail, yeah, not the, yeah.
Any other questions? Well, not seeing, oh, here we go. Thanks.
I was curious whether you looked at the regional transportation model results for the different kinds of neighborhoods and whether they captured any of these effects.
You wanna...
So regional transportation models include income and housing density and transit services and so on. So you could estimate the change in travel from them for different kinds, or the difference in travel from them for different kinds of housing situations, including most of the variables you've talked about. And I'm just curious whether any of them have been compared to your results.
We didn't look at the travel model output on the urban sim side or the PCAS side, but that's part of the dynamics that would be captured in an integrated regional modeling system that was also able to capture predicted changes in rent and other things that would be driving residential displacement. I'd like to think about it more and talk to you after about more of the details, maybe.
We have one on the webinar participants. How is the 50 to 86% accuracy rate determined, and can the tool be viewed yet? I think this is in reference to the off-model tool that you developed.
Right. So of the tracks that gentrified, we were able to predict 50 to 86%, depending on the region. And that was based on a historic analysis and predicting what happened between 2000 and 2013. And then we set up the spreadsheet so that you can plug in, your numbers, your most recent numbers from, say, the American Community Survey on changing demographics and assess the susceptibility to gentrification in your area. That tool is going to be available online, right? Yeah, we'll be posting it.
So it occurs to me that workplace displacement could play a role in VMT change, and the same factors that push people out are going to push certain companies to have to move. Is anybody looking at that? I know it's another big job.
This is exactly where we'd like to go, and we've actually already started to look at commercial and industrial displacement. We have separate studies for that. We couldn't do it all in this study.
All right, we have a question on the webinar. Are there effective methods or strategies to monitor displacement in a timely manner so as to prevent further displacement as soon as it happens, rather than after the fact once a community has been gentrified?
That's the million-dollar question. So the hope is that communities will be able to use our off-model tool, the Excel spreadsheet, and determine for themselves whether something is going on. But even then, we're restricted to American Community Survey data, which is a couple years old and has very large margins of error and other kinds of statistical issues with it. So what we would like to see is the development of different types of monitoring systems that are really, cities using their data capabilities to monitor on a building by building basis change. That's the next step.
Do we have one here in the room? We have more online, so.
Let me get you the mic, because we're recording.
It'll be online. It's
We're
not online.
we're recording this.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
I just want to know
So your time frame brackets the downturn and some substantial changes in gas prices. I don't know if you looked at the effects of that and how that would influence, the VMT, or if it would not be related to displacement. Is kind of a wild card.
I think that's a Dan question, if he's still with us. The time frame of the CHTS and data, and how changing gas prices might have affected the analysis.
There's a time lapse.
Hello?
Hi, Dan. Go ahead.
Hi. Oh, okay. So the question was about gas prices. The short answer is no. We didn't didn't look at that question. I mean, any kind of sort of regional change happening over a long period of time, over this period of time, is something that is implicitly captured in any comparisons between households, for example, living near and far away from rail. They're all experiencing changes in gas prices. So the question is, are there differential effects? And the evidence from the research that looks at gas price elasticities is that there really isn't very much short-term response to gas price elasticities. And long-term elasticities, there is a bit more, but there hasn't been such a long-term trend that there's much evidence that it's going to affect people's VMT, because there's a fair amount of turnover in the vehicle fleet. So my feeling on that, I hadn't really thought about it much, but my feeling on that is it's not likely to affect any of the results.
Here's a question from the webinar. I know that the study was focused on our two most populated areas in California, but have any studies been done like this for the Central Valley? If so, how does the difference in industries that support majority of the job population centers occur when there is little chance to have TOD in those industry areas?
So we, as you saw, we looked at the two regions that had extensive fixed rail transit investments because the study was about transit investments. Ideally, one could expand the study to many other regions around California and look at the role more generally of public investments in gentrification and displacement. Without that, we can't even really speculate what would happen in the Central Valley, and I don't know of another study that has replicated this in the Central Valley, unfortunately.
Questions?
I do have a couple more on the webinar participants. So this one's for you, Dan. Simple observation indicates that low-income households in California, many of whom used to live near and use good transit, are increasingly commuting long distances by car. The design of the study does not capture what we know is occurring. How do you help us account for the difference between observation and your research? So the first part that I read, I think, is an excerpt from the report.
Well, it sounds like the person who's asking the question believes that displacement is causing people to drive a lot more. And we just don't find evidence of that in the cross-sectional data. The only way for us to really query this issue, the claim that the questioner is making, which I think is certainly a good hypothesis, is to, beyond the fact that there's going to be anecdotal evidence of lots of things happening, and I'm sure that that's happening for some households, is to have data which is longitudinal, which actually looks at the same households over time. And unfortunately, we don't have data like that, and so it's really hard for us to observe that phenomenon. What I've come back to, though, is that if you are able to increase overall housing in areas that are conducive to driving less, that's going to tend to have a GHG reduction. If it's only displacement, if it's literally lower-income households being shoved aside by higher-income households, then I think that we're talking about a much more problematic story in terms of regional, state-level GHGs. But if, in fact, what's happening is some displacement, but also increasing population near rail or in areas that are conducive to less driving, I don't think that even the story that the questioner talks about is likely to result in an overall increase in GHG. Even though, yes, the bigger issue is that the households are being displaced. And, VMT is only one criterion. There are lots of other important things to worry about.
Okay, I have one last question from the webcast participants, and then we'll wrap up, unless there's a question here in the room. Okay, so this is for any presenter. In terms of impact on low-income populations, not all VMT is equal. For example, VMT to survive versus VMT for discretionary trips. Trip purpose and destination accessibility matter as well. VMT for higher income households can very well go down in TOD, and VMT in the displaced population could replace that of the higher income people. But the travel cost burden may be higher now if destination accessibility is reduced for the displaced population. This means that policymakers need to account for this in how they use this research. Any comments on that comment?
Oh, I would like to have that comment have the last word. You're absolutely right. And all VMT is not created alike. And I think we really need to understand the travel patterns of low-income households much better than we do today in order to understand really the impacts of displacement. So thank you for the comment.
Great. Thank you all so much for participating, and please do contact me if you have any questions or follow-ups, and visit our research page website for these presentations and the final report. Thanks.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay.